November 1878. San Juan Mountains, southwestern Colorado. Nobody noticed what was happening inside that cave. From the trail below, it looked like any other dark opening in the granite face. Just another hollow carved by centuries of wind and snowmelt. Travelers passed it without a second glance. Miners heading to the silver camps barely registered its existence. It was unremarkable, ordinary, forgettable. But inside, something extraordinary was taking shape. While the valley settlements prepared for winter in the usual way, stacking cordwood, chinkling cabin walls, reinforcing stone chimneys, one woman was building something the region had never seen. Not a cabin, not a dugout, something that would make those conventional structures look fragile when the worst blizzard in recorded history arrived. This is the story of how a hidden decision became a life-saving necessity, how what looked like madness became the only rational shelter, and how the mountain itself, cold, silent, and ancient, proved warmer than anything human hands could frame from timber. The woman who built it wasn't an engineer. She wasn't a mason or a mining expert. She was a widow with limited resources, facing a winter that would kill dozens across the San Juan Range. What she understood about thermal mass, radiant heat, and wind protection came from observation, not education. And when the worst blizzard in recorded history buried the region under 7 feet of snow and sent temperatures plunging to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, her primitive shelter outperformed every conventional cabin in the valley. If you want to see real survival wisdom that worked when life depended on it, hit that subscribe button right now. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one, because what you're about to learn might just save your life someday. Let's go inside that cave. Her name was Ellen Braith, 34 years old, widowed 2 winters prior when a timber accident took her husband outside Silverton. No children, no family within 300 miles. Just a mule, a few tools, and a small claim her husband had filed before he died. A patch of forest land near Cascade Creek, high enough that snow came early and stayed late. She'd spent the summer of 1878 trying to build a cabin the conventional way. Logs from beetle-killed spruce. Foundation stones from the creek bed. A simple rectangular structure, 18 by 14 feet, with a riverstone hearth on the north wall. But by September, she understood the problem. The timber was too green in places, too dry and brittle in others. The logs twisted as they settled. Wind found every gap between the rounds, no matter how much moss and clay she packed into the chinking. The hearth drew poorly. Smoke backed into the room whenever the wind shifted from the west. And the cold? The cold came up through the floorboards like water rising. She'd seen what happened to poorly built cabins at this elevation. She'd seen families burning through cords of wood and still waking to ice on the inside walls. She'd seen children sick from the damp. She'd seen men exhaust themselves feeding fires that barely kept the core temperature above freezing. Ellen Braith didn't have the luxury of failure. That's when she remembered the cave. She'd passed it in August while tracking the mule after it broke its tether. Just a 15-minute walk from her half-finished cabin, tucked into a granite outcrop that rose like a broken tooth from the slope. The opening was maybe 7 feet high and 5 feet wide. Dark, dry, protected from the prevailing wind by the angle of the mountainside. She went back with a lantern. The cave ran back about 30 feet before narrowing to a crack too small to follow. The floor was relatively level, covered in a thin layer of dust and scattered rock. The ceiling arched upward in the center, giving nearly 8 feet of headroom. The walls were solid granite, dense, ancient, cold to the touch. She stood there for nearly an hour, just listening. The cave was absolutely silent. No wind, no dripping water, no echo of the creek below, and more importantly, no dampness. The air was dry, almost stale, which meant no active water seepage. She'd seen enough failed dugouts to know that moisture was the killer. Wet earth bred mold, rotted timber, and made the cold cut deeper. But this granite? It had been here for millennia, shedding water to the outside, keeping the interior bone dry. And that's when Ellen Braith made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone watching. She would build her bedroom inside the mountain. Not the entire living space. Not a dugout. A proper room. A sleeping chamber with walls, a door, a small heating source, constructed within the cave itself, using the granite as both shelter and thermal mass. She didn't announce this to anyone. She simply began. Ellen started by clearing the cave floor. She removed loose rock, leveled the surface with gravel and sand from the creek, and laid down a platform of flat stones, a raised floor that would stay dry and provide a small thermal barrier from the ground. The platform ran 12 feet deep and 8 feet wide, positioned in the center section of the cave, where the ceiling was highest. Then came the walls. She built a stone partition across the cave opening. Not a complete seal, but a barrier that reduced the entrance from 5 feet to roughly 3 feet wide. This smaller opening would limit heat loss while still allowing ventilation. The stones were dry-stacked granite, fitted together without mortar, heavy enough to stay put, tight enough to block wind. Inside the cave, behind that partial wall, she framed a simple wooden structure. For posts of standing dead pine, 8 feet tall, set into gaps between floor stones. Crossbeams at the top, planks along the sides, not fitted tight like cabin walls, but spaced to allow air movement while still creating a defined room within the larger cavern. She insulated the gaps between planks with layered pine boughs, moss, and strips of canvas salvaged from an old wagon cover. The result was a breathable but wind-blocking interior wall. The door was a wool blanket hung on a wooden frame, weighted at the bottom with a sewn-in pocket of sand. For heat, she didn't build a fireplace. She built something simpler. A metal firebox, a salvaged stove grate from her abandoned cabin, set on a raised stone platform near the back corner of the wooden structure. Above it, she rigged a tin chimney pipe that angled upward and exited through a carefully chiseled gap in the cave's natural ceiling vent, a narrow fissure she'd found during her first inspection. The draft worked. Smoke pulled cleanly out of the cave. But the real genius wasn't the stove. It was the granite. Ellen positioned her sleeping platform, a simple wooden frame with rope webbing and layered wool blankets, along the inner cave wall, exactly where the stone absorbed the most heat from the firebox. During the day, a small fire would heat the room. The warmth radiated outward, yes, but it also soaked into the surrounding granite. And granite, once warmed, holds that heat for hours. She tested it in early October, burned a small fire for 2 hours in the afternoon, let die completely, measured the temperature drop with her hand against the stone wall. Even 6 hours later, the rock still radiated a faint warmth. The wooden structure inside stayed noticeably warmer than the open air outside the cave. By late October, Ellen had moved her bedding, her few cooking implements, a small trunk of clothing, and a store of dried foods into the cave chamber. She slept there, cooked there, spent her evenings there while the timber cabin sat empty on the hillside below. The final touch was ventilation control. She hung a second blanket, lighter weight, loosely woven, across the inner doorframe of her wooden structure. This created a double barrier system. The outer stone partition reduced the cave opening, and the inner blanket regulated airflow into her sleeping chamber. On warmer days, she could roll it up completely. On brutal nights, she could drop it fully, creating a pocket of still air that trapped heat without suffocating her. The chimney pipe provided constant draft, pulling fresh air in through the cave entrance and exhausting smoke cleanly through the rock ceiling. It was a balanced system, passive, simple, and nearly foolproof. From the outside, it still looked like nothing, just a dark hole in the rock, a place animals might shelter during a storm. No one knew what she'd built. No one thought to ask. It was a trapper named Virgil Cass who first mentioned it in town. He'd been working a line of sets along Cascade Creek in early November when he saw Ellen coming out of the granite outcrop carrying a water bucket. He watched her disappear back inside, waited, watched smoke rise from somewhere within the rock face. When he got back to the settlement at Onimus Forks, he told the story at the trading post. There's a woman living in a hole up near Cascade. Not a dugout, a cave. Saw smoke coming out the mountain like she's got a fire going inside the rock. People laughed. Not cruel laughter. just the reflexive chuckle of people hearing something that doesn't quite make sense. A woman, alone, living in a cave. It sounded primitive, desperate, strange. That's not a house, someone said. That's a den. She widowed, another asked. Yeah, Braith's widow, the one who tried building that cabin up near the headwaters. Tried and quit, sounds like. One of the older carpenters, a man named Howard Pruitt who'd built half the structures in the valley, shook his head slowly. Living in a cave. That's no way to winter. Stone's colder than timber. No insulation. Moisture seeps right through. She'll be lucky if she don't freeze or suffocate when the snow seals her in. The others nodded. It made sense. Everyone knew caves stayed cold. Everyone knew you built with wood for a reason. Logs insulated. Logs breathed. Logs were how you survived a mountain winter. A cave? That was something you used for a night if you were caught in a storm. Not a season. Not a life. When Ellen came into the settlement a week later to trade for lamp oil and salt, a few people stared. One woman, the wife of a mine foreman, asked her directly, "Are you really living up there in that cave?" Ellen nodded. "I am. That's you built something inside it." "I did." The woman hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "You know you're welcome to stay here in town if it gets bad, don't you? We've got room." "You don't have to, I'm fine," Ellen said. "Thank you." The conversation ended there. People didn't press. They didn't mock her to her face. But the talk continued quietly. Strange woman. Sad situation. Living like an animal because she didn't know better or didn't have the strength to finish what she started. The general consensus, unspoken but understood, was that Ellen Braith would either come down to the settlement before the real cold hit, or she'd be found frozen come spring. Howard Pruitt, the carpenter, mentioned it to his wife one evening while they stacked firewood. "Stone don't insulate," he said flatly. "It conducts. Heat goes right through it into the mountain. She might as well be sleeping on a block of ice." His wife nodded, troubled but not surprised. They'd seen desperate people make desperate choices before. The mountains had a way of correcting bad decisions, usually harshly. Nobody thought her cave would work. Nobody thought it mattered. And then the blizzard came. It started on December 19th, 1878. The temperature had been dropping for 3 days, unusual even for the San Juans in winter. By the morning of the 19th, it was 11 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn. No wind, no clouds, just a brutal, still cold that made breath freeze in the air and would crack like gunshots as it contracted. Then the sky changed. By noon, a flat gray ceiling of cloud had slid in from the northwest. The wind picked up, not gusty, steady, a low, constant push that came straight down the valley like a river of frozen air. The temperature kept falling. 5 degrees. 0. Then below. The snow started just after dark. Not the light, dry powder common to high-altitude storms. This was dense, wet, heavy snow driven sideways by wind that had built to a roar. Visibility dropped to nothing. The world became a white void of noise and cold. In the settlement at Onimus Forks, families huddled in their cabins and fed their fires. Within 2 hours, every chimney in the valley was struggling. The wind created downdrafts that pushed smoke back into the rooms. People had to choose: open a window and lose heat, or keep the cabin sealed and choke on smoke. Either way, the cold found them. Gaps in the chinking, cracks around window frames. The floors, even with rugs, became painfully cold to walk on. Cordwood that had seemed plentiful in October was burning at twice the normal rate. Some families started rationing. A log every 2 hours instead of every hour. Let the fire die down. Let the room cool to 50 degrees, 40 degrees, as long as water didn't freeze. But it kept snowing, and the wind kept blowing. By the second day, drifts had buried ground floor windows. Doors wouldn't open outward. Men had to shovel tunnels just to reach their wood piles. The temperature never rose above -8 degrees Fahrenheit, even at midday. At night, it dropped to -22. Chimneys clogged with ice. Fires went out. People burned furniture to restart them. Children got frostbite sleeping 3 feet from the hearth. Stay with me, because you're about to see why that cave became the only shelter that made sense. Up at Cascade Creek, 15 minutes from the nearest neighbor, Ellen Braith sat in her chamber inside the granite. The blizzard screamed outside. Snow piled against the stone partition at the cave entrance, partially sealing the opening, but not completely. The 3-foot gap she'd left still allowed air to move, just enough, just controlled. Inside the wooden structure within the cave, Ellen had lit a small fire in the metal firebox around midday on the first day of the storm. Not a roaring fire, just enough to bring the interior temperature up. The heat radiated into the granite walls. The stone absorbed it, held it. She let the fire die after 3 hours. The temperature inside her chamber dropped slowly, very slowly. The granite gave back what it had taken. The wooden walls, insulated with boughs and canvas, trapped the radiant warmth. The cave itself, buried in the mountain, stayed insulated from the screaming wind outside. By evening, Ellen checked the temperature by feel. Cool, yes, but not freezing, not even close. She slept under 2 wool blankets. No fire, no light, just the retained heat of stone that had warmed all afternoon. When she woke the next morning, the inside of the cave was 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, it was -12. She lit another small fire. 2 hours this time. Let the granite drink the heat again. Went about her day, reading, mending clothes, rationing her food stores, melting snow for water in a pot on the firebox. The blizzard didn't stop. For days. 5 days. 6. The settlement below burned through their winter wood supply at a catastrophic rate. Families combined into single cabins to share heat. 3 people suffered severe frostbite. 1 elderly man died when his chimney failed and he couldn't restart his fire. Ellen Braith burned 1/8 the wood of a conventional cabin and stayed warmer doing it. When the storm finally broke on December 26th, the world was buried under 7 feet of snow. The sun came out. The wind died. The temperature rose to a bitter but survivable 18 degrees. People began digging out, and that's when someone noticed the smoke. A thin trail rising from the granite outcrop near Cascade Creek. Steady, controlled, still burning. Virgil Cass, the trapper, decided to check on her. He figured she was probably dead, or desperate. He brought an extra blanket and some dried venison, thinking he'd find her half-frozen and grateful for rescue. He found her splitting kindling outside the cave entrance, her face calm, her movements unhurried. "You all right?" he asked. Ellen looked up. "I'm fine." "You?" Cass stared at her, then at the cave, then back at her. "You stayed warm. Warm enough. How much did you burn?" Ellen gestured to a small pile of split logs stacked inside the cave entrance. "Maybe a third of that." Cass did the math in his head. That was less than a quarter cord. Maybe 70 pounds of wood. Over 6 days. In the worst cold he'd ever experienced. His own cabin had burned through nearly 2 cords. He stepped closer to the cave entrance. Felt the air. It wasn't frigid. It wasn't even particularly cold. He could see the faint glow of embers in the firebox inside the wooden structure. The temperature differential was impossible to ignore. Outside, even with the sun now shining, the air bit at exposed skin. Inside that cave, it felt like a cool autumn evening. Not comfortable exactly, but survivable without constant fire. The granite walls still radiated faint warmth from the previous day's heating. Cass placed his bare hand against the stone. It wasn't hot, but it wasn't ice cold either. It was neutral, stable, like the mountain had absorbed the worst of the cold and refused to give it to the interior. "Ow!" Ellen smiled faintly. "The stone. It holds heat. The cave blocks wind. I don't fight the cold. I just let the mountain do the work." Cass returned to the settlement and told everyone what he'd seen. This time, nobody laughed. Word spread through the San Juan settlements like snow melt in spring. By New Year's Day, 1879, every family in Animas Forks had heard the story. The widow who lived in a cave. The woman they'd pitied or quietly mocked. The one they thought would freeze or come begging for shelter. She'd survived the worst blizzard in living memory, using less wood than anyone in the valley. Not just survived, thrived. People wanted to see it for themselves. In early January, 3 men made the trek up to Cascade Creek. One was Howard Pruitt, the carpenter who'd confidently declared that stone conducted heat away from a body. The others were miners who'd nearly lost fingers to frostbite during the blizzard despite burning through their entire winter wood supply in 6 days. Ellen showed them inside. The cave still held residual warmth from a fire she'd lit that morning. The firebox had gone cold 2 hours earlier, but the granite walls radiated a gentle, persistent heat. The interior temperature was around 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, it was 19 degrees. Pruitt stood in the center of the wooden chamber and didn't speak for nearly a minute. He touched the stone wall, felt the warmth, looked at the simple construction, the raised stone floor, the insulated wooden frame, the blanket door, the metal firebox with its angled chimney. "This shouldn't work," he finally said. Ellen smiled faintly. "But it does." One of the miners, a man named Jack Stillwater, asked the question everyone was thinking. Could this work anywhere? Or just this cave? Ellen considered. Any cave with these conditions. Dry, solid rock, protected from prevailing wind, deep enough that the back wall stays stable temperature. And you need a natural vent or a way to drill one for the chimney. Not every cave has that. But there's dozens of caves like this in these mountains, Stillwater said. Then there's dozens of shelters, Ellen replied. The men left quietly. They didn't apologize for doubting her. Mountain men rarely did, but their silence carried a weight of respect that hadn't been there before. By February, the first adaptation appeared. A prospector named Samuel Oates had been working a claim near Cinnamon Pass, living in a poorly insulated dugout that nearly killed him during the December blizzard. He'd heard about Ellen's cave. His claim sat beneath a granite ridge honeycombed with shallow caves, none as large as Ellen's, but several big enough for a man to crouch inside. Oates picked the deepest one, about 12 feet back into the rock. He didn't build a wooden structure inside. Instead, he did something simpler. He dry-stacked a stone wall across the cave entrance, leaving a small gap for a door, and positioned his bedroll against the back wall. He built a tiny firebox from scrap iron and vented it through a crack in the ceiling he widened with a chisel. It worked. Not as efficiently as Ellen's more elaborate design, but well enough. He burned half the wood his dugout had required. The cave stayed dry. The temperature remained stable. When he came into Anonymous Forks in March to resupply, he told everyone who would listen, she wasn't crazy. She was smarter than all of us. By the spring of 1879, the technique had a name in the local vernacular, cave backing. It wasn't a formal term. It didn't appear in any mining manuals or homesteading guides. But when two prospectors met on a trail and discussed their winter shelters, they understood what it meant. You found a suitable cave. You built a barrier at the entrance to control airflow. You positioned your living space to take advantage of the rock's thermal mass. You heated sparingly and let the stone do the rest. Within 3 years, at least 11 shelters in the San Juan Range incorporated some version of the technique. Most were temporary camps, prospectors and trappers using natural caves as seasonal bases. A few were more permanent. One family near Red Mountain Pass actually built a hybrid structure, a log cabin with its back wall removed and the entire rear section built directly into a granite outcrop. The stone formed the fourth wall and acted as a massive heat sink. They reported fuel savings of nearly 40% compared to conventional cabins of similar size. Ellen Braith herself never promoted the technique. She didn't write about it. She didn't give demonstrations or charge for advice. When people asked, she explained. When they didn't, she stayed quiet. She lived in her cave chamber for 4 more winters before eventually building a small, well-insulated cabin nearby, using lessons learned from her years inside the mountain. Even then, she kept the cave functional. During the coldest stretches, she still slept there. The granite never failed her. In 1883, a surveyor from the U.S. Geological Survey passed through the region and noted the phenomenon in his field journal. He wrote, "Encountered several mining camps utilizing natural rock formations as primary shelter components. Local inhabitants report significant fuel efficiency gains. One woman, Mrs. Braith, appears to be the originating practitioner. Her method demonstrates practical understanding of thermal mass principles that many trained engineers overlook." The journal entry was filed in a government archive and forgotten. But the knowledge didn't disappear. It spread quietly, mouth to mouth, camp to camp, carried by people who'd felt the difference between a cabin that fought the cold and a shelter that worked with the mountain. By 1890, scattered across the Colorado Rockies, there were at least 30 documented cases of cave-back shelters. By 1900, the number had likely doubled, though most went unrecorded. The technique never became mainstream. It required specific geography. It required a willingness to build unconventionally. And it required people to trust something that looked primitive. But for those who understood it, the lesson was clear. The mountain wasn't the enemy. The mountain was the solution. Ellen Braith died in 1904 at the age of 60. She's buried in a small cemetery outside Silverton. Her gravestone lists her name, her dates, and nothing else. There's no mention of a cave, no reference to the blizzard, no monument to the technique that saved her life and influenced dozens of others. But if you hike up to Cascade Creek today, the cave is still there. The wooden structure is long gone, rotted away by time and weather. The metal firebox rusted into fragments. The stone partition has partially collapsed. But the cave itself, the granite, the arching ceiling, the dry floor, the fissure that once vented smoke, remains exactly as it was in 1878. And if you step inside on a cold day, you'll notice something. The air is still warmer than the outside. Not much, just a few degrees, but enough to feel. The mountain still remembers what Ellen Braith taught it. What Ellen Braith understood, what the so-called experts missed, was this: survival isn't about overpowering nature. It's about working with what nature already provides. The granite that looked cold and dead was actually a battery, capable of storing and releasing heat over hours. The cave that looked primitive was actually a precision-engineered shelter, protecting against wind, insulating against temperature swings, and maintaining livable conditions with minimal fuel. Modern building science has proven everything Ellen knew by instinct. Thermal mass works. Wind protection works. Passive heating works. The numbers back it up. Stone with high thermal mass can store 20 to 30 BTUs per cubic foot per degree of temperature change. A well-positioned heat source warming granite for a few hours can release that warmth steadily for 12 to 16 hours. A wind-protected shelter can reduce heat loss by 60 to 70% compared to exposed structures. Ellen's cave wasn't magic. It was physics. But here's what makes her story matter. She didn't have the science. She had observation, necessity, and the courage to try something everyone else dismissed. And when the crisis came, her primitive shelter outperformed everything modern engineering had built. That's the lesson. Not that we should all live in caves, but that the wisdom of people who had to survive, who couldn't afford to fail, is worth paying attention to. The techniques they developed weren't backwards. They were solutions tested by the harshest judge, winter in the mountains. So here's my question for you. What part of Ellen's solution could you apply today? Maybe you don't have a cave, but do you have a basement corner you could insulate better? A north wall you could back with stone or brick to store heat? A wind-exposed window you could protect with a simple barrier? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what the coldest winter you've ever faced was. Because these stories aren't just history. They're instruction manuals written in survival. And if this video taught you something real, something you could actually use, hit that subscribe button. Every week, I bring you techniques that worked when life depended on it. Real solutions. Real results. No theory. Just what kept people alive. Thanks for watching. Stay warm. And remember, the mountain isn't your enemy. It's your ally, if you know how to listen. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.